The small town of Willow Creek was buzzing with excitement. The long-anticipated wedding of Claire and David had finally taken place, and it was nothing short of a fairy tale. Guests marveled at the elegant decorations, the soft glow of candlelight, flickering against crystal chandeliers. The scent of fresh roses filled the air as Claire, stunning in a white gown that clung to her figure perfectly, walked down the aisle. David stood at the altar, his eyes filled with pure admiration. He had loved Claire from the moment he met her, and now she was finally his wife. The ceremony was flawless. Every vow spoken, every promise made, seemed to echo with sincerity. Friends and family cheered as the newlyweds shared their first kiss as husband and wife. It was a picture-perfect moment, one that would be framed and remembered forever. The reception was just as breathtaking. A grand hall decorated with gold accents and shimmering lights welcomed the guests. Laughter and music filled the space as people danced, toasting to a lifetime of happiness for the couple. Claire and David moved effortlessly across the dance floor, lost in each other's gaze. Everything about that night suggested love, commitment, and the start of something beautiful. But beneath the surface, Claire carried a secret that no one could have imagined. While David had been planning for their future, believing in the strength of their bond, Claire had been entertaining a dangerous temptation. Her affair with Eric had started months before the wedding, a thrilling escape from reality, a forbidden romance that she convinced herself would end before she said, "I do." Yet it had continued, growing into something she couldn't seem to let go of. On the night of her bachelorette party, while David celebrated with his friends in another part of town, Claire had slipped away to meet Eric one last time. At least, that was what she had told herself. It was supposed to be over after that night, a memory to lock away and never revisit. But as the wedding approached, she found herself drawn back to him again and again. Even as she exchanged vows with David, even as she promised to be faithful, for the rest of her life, a part of her remained tangled in the web of her affair. She had reassured herself that it didn't mean anything, that it was just a passing infatuation. David would never find out, and she could live the perfect life she had always dreamed of. As the wedding night stretched into the early hours of the morning, Claire stood on the balcony of their honeymoon suite, gazing at the city lights. David was asleep inside, exhausted from the whirlwind of the day. She should have been content, happy beyond words. But instead she reached for her phone, her fingers hesitating over Eric's name. Just one last time, she thought. One final message before she let it all go. She had no idea that this decision would set off a chain of events that would end in tragedy. Just days after the wedding, David began to notice subtle but unsettling changes in Claire's behavior. At first, he dismissed them as nothing more than the usual adjustments that came with married life. They had only just begun their journey together, and it was natural for things to feel different. But, as time passed, his unease grew. Claire, who had once been affectionate and engaged, now seemed distracted. She spent more time on her phone, often turning the screen away when he entered the room. Her laughter, once so genuine and full of warmth, now felt forced, like she was playing a role rather than truly enjoying their moments together. At first, David tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was overwhelmed. Marriage was a big change, and perhaps she just needed time to adjust. But the more he paid attention, the more his doubts took root. She had started making excuses to leave the house. Trips to the grocery store that took hours, sudden plans with friends he had never heard of before. When he asked about her day, her answers were vague, her stories inconsistent. The feeling that something was wrong gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night as he stared at the ceiling, wondering if he was imagining things. Then, everything changed with a single message. One evening, as David scrolled through his social media, a notification popped up. A friend had sent him a series of photos along with a brief but chilling message. "I thought you should see this." With a growing sense of dread, he opened the images. His hands trembled as he swiped through them. Claire, in the arms of another man. Their bodies were close, too close for it to be innocent. In one of the pictures, she was kissing him. David felt the air leave his lungs. His mind refused to believe what his eyes were showing him. These weren't old photos taken before their wedding. The timestamp told him everything he needed to know. They had been taken just 2 nights ago, after they had said their vows, after Claire had promised to be his forever. A sharp pain twisted in his chest. His heart pounded in his ears as anger and betrayal crashed over him like a tidal wave. How could she do this to him? How could she look him in the eyes every day and pretend that she loved him? He had given her everything, trusted her completely, only to be made a fool of. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair itself. It was the lies, the deception, the way she had walked down the aisle knowing she was already breaking her vows. David clenched his fists, his mind racing through a storm of emotions. He wanted answers. He wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation. But as he sat there, staring at the damning evidence in front of him, something else took hold of him. The rage inside him was growing, and it was becoming harder to control. David didn't confront Claire immediately. The shock of betrayal had left him numb, his mind struggling to process the reality of what he had seen. Instead of acting on impulse, he decided to observe, to watch her every move and gather the truth for himself. He began paying closer attention, noting the times she left the house, the excuses she gave, the way she always seemed to be guarding her phone. Every little action that had once seemed normal now stood out like flashing warning signs. She was careful, but not careful enough. He noticed how she would glance at her phone and smile when she thought no one was watching. He saw the way she would rush to answer messages, only to lock the screen the moment he walked into the room. She had started dressing differently when she went out, putting more effort into her appearance on nights when she claimed she was meeting friends. David didn't say anything. He simply watched, the anger inside him building with each passing day. One evening, Claire told him she was going to visit an old friend who was in town for the weekend. She acted casual, but David could see through the lie. Without saying a word, he waited until she left before grabbing his keys and following her. He kept his distance as he trailed her car through the streets of Willow Creek. His heart pounded in his chest, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he realized she wasn't heading toward any friend's house. Instead, she drove to the outskirts of town, to a small, run-down motel. David parked a safe distance away, his breathing shallow as he watched Claire step out of her car. Moments later, another vehicle pulled up. A man got out. Even from a distance, David recognized him. It was the same man from the photos. Claire didn't hesitate. She walked straight into his arms, their embrace lasting longer than necessary. David felt something inside him snap. He had seen enough. Driving back home, his hands shook against the wheel, his mind spiraling with thoughts he had never allowed himself to entertain before. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion or a possibility. It was real. The woman he had loved, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with, had broken him in a way that could never be repaired. The humiliation, the anger, the overwhelming sense of loss, they all collided into something dark and unrecognizable inside him. By the time he reached their home, his decision had already been made. There would be no confrontation, no dramatic argument. He didn't need to hear her excuses or false apologies. He had loved Claire deeply, but now that love had turned into something else entirely. As he sat in the darkness of their bedroom, staring at the empty space where she should have been, a single thought echoed through his mind. She had chosen to betray him. Now, it was his turn to decide what came next. David spent the next day in complete silence, his mind consumed by what he had witnessed. He barely ate, barely moved, his thoughts circling the same dark reality over and over again. Claire had lied to him. She had stood before their friends and family, vowed to be faithful, and only days later she had thrown it all away for another man. The rage inside him no longer burned. It had settled into something colder, something far more dangerous. He no longer wanted an explanation. He no longer wanted the truth. He had seen it with his own eyes. Now, all he wanted was justice. That evening, he decided to act. He prepared dinner, setting the table with the same care he had on their wedding night. Candles flickered softly in the dim light of the dining room, their glow casting long shadows against the walls. He cooked Claire's favorite meal, pouring her a glass of wine as he waited for her to return. He knew she would be late. He knew where she had been. But tonight, he played the part of the devoted husband, one last time. When Claire finally walked through the door, she looked surprised to see the effort he had put into the evening. She hesitated for a moment, as if sensing something was off, but then she smiled and sat down across from him. They ate in near silence, with David watching her every movement. He could see it in her eyes, the guilt, the nervousness. She wasn't as good at hiding it as she thought. After dinner, David suggested they take a drive. He told her he had been thinking about their honeymoon, about the nights they had spent watching the sunset together. He wanted to relive that moment, to remind themselves of what their marriage was supposed to be. Claire agreed, perhaps thinking that this was her chance to smooth things over, to keep her secret hidden just a little longer. She had no idea that she was already out of time. They drove in silence, the road stretching into darkness as they left the lights of the town behind. The destination was a remote overlook, a place where they had once spent countless hours dreaming about their future. David pulled the car to a stop, turning off the engine. The night was quiet, the only sound being the wind whispering through the trees. Then, he finally spoke. He told her he knew everything. Claire's face drained of color, her hands trembling, as she tried to form words. There were no lies left to tell. No more excuses. No more secrets. She started to cry, to beg, but David didn't hear her. The rage he had suppressed for days now took full control. It happened fast. Claire barely had time to react before David's hands were around her throat. She struggled, her nails clawing at his arms, her gasps turning into choked sobs. But he didn't stop. Not until the betrayal, the pain, and the humiliation had all disappeared along with the last breath she took. David sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The world around him was silent, except for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Claire's lifeless body lay beside him in the passenger seat, her once vibrant eyes now dull and empty. The reality of what he had done settled over him like a crushing weight. The rage that had consumed him only moments ago had faded, leaving behind an eerie calm. He hadn't planned what to do next. There was no escape, no way to undo what had just happened. His mind raced through every possible scenario. He could run, he could hide the body, he could try to make it look like an accident. But deep down he knew there was no point. There was no coming back from this. For a long time he just sat there, staring into the darkness ahead. Images of their wedding day flashed through his mind. The way she had smiled at him, the way she had promised to love him forever. It all felt like a cruel joke now. He had given her everything, and in return, she had betrayed him. But now, he had taken everything from her too. Finally, David started the car. He drove through the empty roads, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with every passing mile. He didn't go home. He didn't go anywhere to hide. Instead, he pulled into the parking lot of the Willow Creek Police Department. The building stood under the glow of streetlights, its presence looming over him like a final judgment. David stepped out of the car, his body moving as if on autopilot. Each step toward the station felt heavier than the last. He pushed open the doors and walked up to the front desk, his voice eerily calm as he spoke the words that would change his life forever. "I killed my wife." The officer at the desk blinked in confusion, as if unsure he had heard correctly. But David didn't waver. He repeated himself, this time with more certainty. Within moments, he was surrounded by officers, his hands pulled behind his back, the cold steel of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. He didn't resist. He didn't speak another word.